Data protection is a top priority with today's work-from-home workforce. However, current data loss prevention tools inadequately protect data in cloud or SaaS offerings from insider threats. Secure Circle automatically protects data as it leaves SaaS services such as GitHub, AWS, and Salesforce. The protection is transparent to users and works with any application to persistently protect data, even source code. Secure your data with Secure Circle's Zero Trust Data Protection. Begin your 30-day free trial by visiting securityweekly.com/Secure Circle. CrowdStrike stops breaches. These days, critical work isn't done from the protection of a corporate network. It happens at cafes, back offices, and at home. New ways of working mean new attacks. New attacks require new defenses. CrowdStrike stops breaches so you can do what you do best. CrowdStrike, we stop so you can go. CrowdStrike is offering Security Weekly listeners 15 days free access to its platform. See how it works at securityweekly.com/CrowdStrike. Can we continue to function without facts? Cybercriminals exploit the absence of facts, harming organizations through the easiest point of entry, email. No company should claim they can stop all phishing attacks. It's about having all the facts in seconds and reducing the time it takes to respond. It's minutes versus hours in the difference between a security incident and a breach. Great Horn. See through the dark. To learn more, go to securityweekly.com/Greathorn. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. Security Weekly, in partnership with the Cyber Risk Alliance, is excited to present Security Weekly Unlocked on December 10th, 2020. That's right, the inaugural edition of Security Weekly Unlocked also celebrates Security Weekly's 15th anniversary. Registration and call for speakers is now open, so please go register and submit your talks. I know a few of our friends have submitted talks since the last time we mentioned it. securityweekly.com/unlocked to submit your session and register for free. This is a free event, so I'm very excited about that. Cris Neckar is the Chief Information Security Officer of Spring Labs, providing a decentralized and transformative infrastructure for secure data exchange. Today, he'll be discussing trading least privilege for security theater. I love it anytime we're talking about security theater because there's a lot of that. Cris, welcome.
Hey, guys. How's it going?
It's going good. It's going good. So, Cris, tell us about this trade-off we're making for security theater.
Yeah, so I mean, a little background first. So I come out of the kind of research, the development world. Spent a lot of time in consulting. I'm relatively new to this whole being a security executive thing, and I kind of see that as an opportunity to look at the world as it exists with new eyes. It's kind of that hacker mentality. And one of the first things that sort of surprised me was how often I'm asked to sacrifice least privilege just on a daily basis. And it's not coming from the places that you would expect. You expect to get that from your engineers. You expect to get that from, business people looking for new things that they can do with data, things like that. But in fact, it's all coming from security vendors.
Yeah.
So, on a daily basis, I get emails from these vendors, and I sit there and I go, well, how does this product work? And you start to think through it, and you start to talk to them about it. And in pretty much every case, it's like, well, we need access to your data. So visibility is the king. Pretty much every vendor that you'll ever talk to has some variation of the tagline: "You can't protect what you can't see." And that comes with a lot of caveats. That comes with, you have to give this thing access to all of your data in transit or all of your data at rest or sometimes the keys to the kingdom, like in the form of credentials to your most sensitive databases or things like that. So.
Yeah, Matt, go ahead. We've seen this a lot in the past. Actually.
Oh, we see a ton of this, right? I mean, when I was in the container security space, right, one of the ways to gain visibility into the container environment was to run a privileged container, which is basically root access to your entire container environment. And not only was it a security violation, Cris, they wanted to shove all the data through that privileged container to drop performance of the entire application at the same time, right? So I came up with this tagline like "No root, don't give up root." Right. But a lot of solutions require you to give it up.
And the danger with that, Cris, Matt, to this point is in this case, right? A privileged container technically isn't running as root, right? The user isn't root. However, it has all of the capabilities that a root user would have. So it's somewhat misleading that, yes, I have this privileged container, and one could say, well, it's not running as root, but inside the Linux kernel, you've granted it all of the capabilities that typically you would only reserve for the root user. So in that sense, it's like, it's even worse. Just the perception of it is bad. And this is often the case with security vendors, to your point, Cris, where they say, well, we need this level of access, but we don't need root, but we need this level of access, which is the same thing, right?
And that's not even speaking to, on the network level. Now, what does that privileged container have access to as far as other microservices? What does it have access to as far as management services for, your Kubernetes environment or something like that? Mm-hmm. And also, you're opening up all of that internal attack surface where, we've locked down, we're running a Docker container and we've locked it down, but all it takes is one kernel bug, right? Yeah. So you're now one bug away from
not even
from your host machine as well.
With certain capabilities, you can basically inject or load a kernel module that shovels you back a root shell.
Right? even from the perspective of configuration options, I mean, it's very easy to misconfigure a privileged container.
Yep.
To make it very easy to pop a shell on the host OS. So if we look at kind of it makes perfect sense how we got here. I mean, if we look at sort of the history of security products, I think it all starts with antivirus, right? We had this problem of this malicious code that we're getting names assigned to them, and these are associated with hashes. So we're like, all that we need to do is anytime that this hash, data with this hash hits a file system, we need an indicator and we need to block this thing. And then people start thinking about heuristics and things like that. And they're like, well, now we need to shove a kernel module or a driver into the kernel so that we can actually catch this at the right system call, so that it never even hits execution. And so there's this temptation to just keep putting things in more and more privileged places, from the very beginning of the security industry, basically. And now we do things like we put SSL signing certs on our network devices that get access to all traffic, right? So we're actually stripping SSL and creating a single point of failure for all traffic. With some data loss prevention solutions, we're actually giving this single thing access to every database and every file system and every file in our environment, saying we trust you to tell us where this stuff is. It's not that any of these things are bad in and of themselves. It's just this idea of understanding where your data is, understanding least privilege, understanding the data flows, and then having the faith in yourself to manage, the data residency and data lifetime.
We dealt with this in the vulnerability management front for sure, right? Because you could scan without any privileges, right? And that gets you only so far in terms of visibility into your systems. Then you get into this condition where you're like, well, do I grant the scanner access to my systems, and how do I manage and control that? Or do I deploy an agent, right? And I think that's one reason why we see a lot of different agent technologies, because and becoming more popular, because if you can put an agent on the system that doesn't require as many privileges, which is always a really good question to ask of your vendors, right? Then I can remove that requirement of my scanner has, Windows domain admin privileges or in administrative rights to all of my systems, which it would need to identify those vulnerabilities, right? And that's another place I've seen this.
Yeah, and that's another point I wanted to bring up, was the idea of the agent, running on every system in the enterprise environment. I think so. I come out of most recently the security consulting, kind of pen testing, red teaming world, and it's not uncommon when you get access to a workstation in an enterprise. It's not uncommon to see 5 or 7 different agents, with different levels of privilege, different levels of access on that system. And honestly, the first thing that we would do from a pen testing perspective was often look at these things, look at the vendors, and say which one of these has a lot of privilege, but also probably hasn't been vetted very well from a security perspective, because all it takes is one bug in that, and now you have this uniform code that is running on every workstation and maybe even every server in the enterprise. And if you can find a single bug, especially one that lets you go from host to host, now you've got the whole enterprise. So that's, just the idea of uniform code as well. I mean, we talk about, a bug in the Windows kernel being really bad because it gets you access to pretty much everything as opposed to only one specific thing. An agent, basically, especially an agent with a device driver as a component of it, gets you the same thing, which is why we see researchers going after things like AV engines and especially the sort of detection engines within the kernel. And
CyberArk just produced a report. I don't know if you saw that, Chris.
I did not see the CyberArk report, but
so just this week, a day ago, is when this article was put out. CyberArk tested anti-malware products from a whole host of vendors that you would, Kaspersky, McAfee, Symantec, Fortinet, Checkpoint, and found that there was a common bug in all of them that allowed attackers to gain higher privileges. So backing up exactly what you're talking about. I've been dug into the research.
Code.
Yeah,
that was actually exactly. It's very similar to the research that Greg Osa and I did years ago in the forensic space. Like we realized that there were only really 2 forensic investigations pieces of software that were accepted by courts. So we just found the common component and found one bug, and basically like all we needed was a file, and we could take over every solution rather than just one. And that's true of, any of these pieces of specialized software. Very often, AV needs to do things like emulate, x86 code, for example. There are a small number of libraries that do that, and they're probably using those open source libraries to do it because, writing your own emulator is a lot of work.
Right. Yeah. I saw this back in the day with backup software too. Remember I think it was Backup Exec used to have some heinous flaws, and it was like a happy day in a pen tester's life when you found that running on every system and it was vulnerable because it needed access to all the files, right?
Backup Exec was so great because it was also on the management network, which often got you into production environments and stuff like that too.
Yeah, we were covering in the last segment, Paul, SIFT, which is the open source tool that Anchor just put out about building a software bill of materials. I mean, truly, how many people have a software bill of materials for their product to know what are all those common components and what are the potential flaws or vulnerabilities in those? Chris, a lot of people are not at that level when it comes to, kind of openness in what's in their code.
Yeah, and I think that's the important takeaway from all of this. I mean, just again looking at this world with kind of new eyes and not having previously, in the past I was worried about how do I get from point A to point B, or in the case of being a software engineer, how do we define least privilege? How do we define like data lifetime? How do we define data residency? And how do we sandbox? How do we put up basically security boundaries? And I think that is lost a little bit on the modern enterprise because you're being hammered all day long with security vendors basically telling you here's the magic pill, and if you take this, if you install this device, if you install this agent, if you install this networking equipment, all of a sudden all of your security woes will be solved. And I don't think that anybody realistically falls for that hook, line, and sinker. But I do think that the more that message is sort of shoved out there, the more you tend to think like, when we talk about cybersecurity frameworks, the ways to build your cybersecurity program include you must have this, you must have this, you must have this, you must have these categories of things. And if that's the level that you're looking at this stuff from, you're missing the big picture, I think, is the key point.
Chris, what can we do from a due diligence perspective to make sure that we don't introduce this type of vulnerability and pathway for attackers into our networks?
So I think the really important thing, and this was what made me interested in Spring Labs from the beginning. But the important thing that we can do is look at data residency and look at whether we really need data in all of these places. So the sort of trend that I see in every industry really is data silos, right? So it's an enterprise will hold on to the sensitive data, and internally they may not know where all it is. They may not know even what they have specifically, but they're very, very protective of it, and because it gives them some form of competitive advantage, right? And then they will sign a contract after a lot of due diligence with another company and just shovel all of that data over to them. So that's why we end up in situations with these breaches like Equifax, for example, where once you have the data, once you get access to the database, you've got access to everything. The reality is, in most cases, there doesn't need to be a database with everything in it. There doesn't need to be a single S3 bucket that contains, these files with all of these rows of every consumer in the US's, social security number and whatever. If we plan our data flows, if we plan our data residency, we can actually answer the questions that we need to answer from a business perspective with much less data than the full scope of everything that we can collect from consumers or from research or data studies or whatever. So my sort of strategy on all of this, and we'll see if this is correct or not. But I basically, from the point that we're actually speccing out a product, we try to say, what is the absolute, when do you actually need this data? What do you actually want to get from it? And what can you convert it into on a metadata level that answers, that fulfills the same thing? And then once we can get rid of the actual sensitive stuff, once we can get rid of, things like social security numbers, things like phone numbers, things like email addresses, we shred that and we don't need it anymore because now we have the metadata that's actually important about it. And that's really what Spring is trying to do from a data residency perspective. Is actually, we have achieved in most cases, we don't even get access to the sensitive information because that's not the stuff that matters to answer the questions that people care about.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was at Qualys, I remember a lot of people being concerned about PII when some of the early privacy regulations were coming down. And one of the interesting challenges was, the IP address was considered, a piece of PII. And it was also, there's just some very interesting ways that the data is stored. But to your point, Cris, if I can flip the model and say, look, if I can take sensitive data and not make it available as like my primary key in my database, right?
Exactly.
Then I get the ability to hide that data or tokenize that data or do something else so I don't potentially expose it. And so data architecture plays a part in this broader discussion, is because you really have to think about how to architect your data structures to minimize how much of that sensitive data is even available to be exposed.
Yeah, and so I like to call it entity resolution, right? So it's like using something sensitive as the primary key, or using the email address of someone as the username, for example. Automatically now necessitates that you actually have to store that thing. And I think IP address is actually a really interesting example that we can sort of dig into a little bit. But sort of the model that we use is, so the thing that you actually care about in almost every case is not actually the IP address. It's things like the country that the IP address comes from. It's things like the ISP that's associated with the IP address. It's things like the organization that owns the block that controls that IP address. It's things like that. It's not the IP address itself. The IP address itself is pretty much useless unless you know a lot about the network architecture of the actual network that you're talking to, and are doing, maybe the reverse DNS lookup of the IP address is interesting, the host name that's associated with it, but it's not the IP address. It's just a piece of data. So when you get that IP address in, and I'm not saying that I agree that an IP address is necessarily PII, but when you get an IP address in, if instead of just storing that in your database and saying, like, we don't know what we want to do with this yet, but we'll figure it out later, you go, what do I actually want to convert this into? It doesn't have to be an inline process. You can just kick it to some back-end job that eventually goes, let's convert this to like the company that has this IP like address range registered. Let's convert this to the country of the geo IP lookup, things like that. Maybe even let's convert this to like, the subnet that this thing is on, but we don't need the actual the last octet of the IP address itself. So if you can convert it into that metadata, nobody's going to say like, oh, if you get breached and you lose a database with a whole bunch of company names that are, loosely associated with data, because they were the company names that were registered to the IP block that was hitting your data. It's not going to be nearly as big a news story as if you lose like a bunch of usernames associated with their actual IP address that now gets you the ability to route back to their computer potentially.
Great example.
Matt, any more questions for Cris?
No, I'm good, actually. Thank you.
Cris, closing thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think we covered most of kind of what I'm interested in talking about, and I think that my main point here is I think the security industry as a whole, and I really think that this is happening. I don't think that we're in some dangerous spot where all of a sudden everybody thinks that security products are solving everybody's problems. But it's more about the threat modeling stage. It's more about the software engineering stage. It's more about making sure that we know where data lives and for how long it lives there, and making sure that the systems that we're architecting have access to the least amount of that data that they possibly can, than it is about tacking on a security solution after the fact and going, good enough, right?
Awesome. Cris, thank you so much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thank you, guys. This has been fun.
With that, we'll take a short break and come back with our next interview with Jen Ayers from CrowdStrike. Stay tuned.